Number 8. Lark LX amphibious vehicles. In 2022, beachgoers at Island Beach State Park in Ocean County, New Jersey were perplexed when two extremely rare Vietnam-era amphibious vehicles appeared on the shore overnight. As it turned out, a brother and a sister from Virginia who were involved in marine construction had bought them from a previous owner in Staten Island. They were navigating them to Chesapeake Bay when they ran into mechanical issues. After losing 2 engines, they decided it would be wisest to pull over and fix the vehicles. John Hennage, who was driving one of the vehicles, told local station News 12 New Jersey that the area where he runs his business lacks the infrastructure to easily transport materials in from the road, and that the amphibious vehicles enable the company to import a lot of what they need by water. Unfortunately, they ran into problems even after spending months repairing the vehicles. These amphibious giants were both identified as Lark LXs. Weighing in at 200,000 tons, the Lark LX is the largest amphibious craft ever built by the U.S. military. It was built in 1952 and improved upon from there, with the first Lark LXs seeing active duty in South Vietnam in 1967. The Lark LX was designed for carrying tanks and shipping containers and could hold up to 100 tons of cargo or around 200 people. On land, each wheel was powered by a 265 horsepower diesel engine. In the water, the 4 engines worked in pairs to drive 2 propellers. The vehicles reached a top speed of 20 miles per hour on land and 7.5 miles per hour on water. The military retired the last of its Larks in 2001. There are only 5 or 6 functional examples left in the world, according to Hennage. Most are privately owned, and a few are reportedly used by construction companies. Number 7. Strump Panzer I Bison. Unofficially dubbed the Strump Panzer I Bison, the 15 cm SIG 33 SF Auf Panzerkampfwagen 1 Aus FB was a German self-propelled gun that was used during World War II. After learning that the infantry had trouble keeping up with tanks during combat during the German invasion of Poland, the military began mounting the gun on the chassis of a tank to carry it into battle. A separate vehicle carried the ammunition, and the setup only offered the shooter minor protection from the small shell fragments and debris. Altogether, around 38 of the modified guns were created. These photos appear to show a Strump Panzer I Bison that was recovered from a German river in 1995. It's likely safe to assume that it's one of just a few surviving examples of the rare gun, although it's unclear what ended up happening to the one in these images. Number 6. World War II Swamp Boat. Lake Mead is Nevada's largest reservoir. It's made headlines many times recently as the region struggles with droughts and dramatically decreasing water levels. In 2022, the lake hit a record low. And while less water is never good news when it comes to Lake Mead, the rapidly receding waters have revealed a plethora of fascinating finds, including a World War II-era landing craft known as a Higgins boat. Designed during the 1930s by a boat builder from New Orleans named Andrew Higgins, the boat was based on its inventor's previous American swamp boats. Over 23,000 of the mostly plywood vessels were built throughout the Second World War. They were mainly used for carrying soldiers and fighting vehicles from ships to beaches and played a major role in the Allied invasion of Normandy, famously known as D-Day. The Higgins boat that appeared along Lake Mead's rapidly shrinking shoreline was sold to a private buyer as military surplus after the war, according to Las Vegas Review-Journal. Its owner used it to survey the Colorado River before selling it to a marina on Lake Mead, where it was scuttled as part of a breakwater. Now that it sits on dry land, it's hard to believe that the boat was once 185 feet underwater and functioned as a popular diving tourism site. What else do you think they'll find in Lake Mead as the water levels continue to drop? Tell us in the comments below and hit that subscribe button while you're at it. Number 5. USS Main. Built during the late 19th century, the USS Main was the first U.S. Navy ship to be named after the state of Maine. It was designed as a state-of-the-art advanced vessel that reflected the newest technological developments of the time. But by the time construction on the ship was finished 9 years later, the Main was obsolete. It was nevertheless put to use in Havana Harbor to protect American interests during the Cuban War of Independence. On February 15, 1898, the ship exploded and sank. The exact cause of the sinking is unknown. Some argued that it was hit by a mine, while others believed that the fire started internally. In 1911, the Main's hull was repaired and it was refloated. It was towed to a sea and resunk in a location 3,600 feet below the surface. The ship's mast was recovered and now stands as a memorial to its fallen crew members in Arlington National Cemetery. Number 4. Admiral Graf Spe. The German battleship Admiral Graf Spe was built in the mid-1930s as a symbol of the Nazis' naval might as World War II approached. During its short-lived career, it sailed throughout the South Atlantic, raiding and sinking at least 9 Allied merchant ships. In 1939, the ship was struck around 70 times by warships from New Zealand and Britain, leaving 36 men dead and more than 60 injured. Captain Hans Langsdorff navigated to the port at Montevideo in Uruguay to see about having the ship repaired. Although Uruguay was officially neutral, the country was on friendly terms with Britain. Langsdorff knew that if he let the ship undergo repairs, the Uruguayan government would let British officers on board, and that the ship would be interned for the rest of the war if it stayed in port for more than 3 days. Repairs would take an estimated 2 weeks and therefore weren't an option. Langsdorff ordered his crew to destroy all important equipment on the ship. The next day, he and 40 crew members moved the Graf Spe out into the harbor's shallow outer waters and deliberately scuttled it. It burned for the next 2 days until it slipped beneath the surface and came to rest 36 feet underwater. 2 days later, Langsdorff took his own life in a hotel room in Buenos Aires, Argentina. A salvage team began working to raise the wreck in 2004. Because it was considered a navigational hazard, both the Uruguayan government and several members of the private sector funded the recovery effort. Workers soon discovered that the operation would prove to be a lot more complicated than they had anticipated due to challenging winds and currents. Only parts of the Admiral Graf Spe were salvaged, including an 880-pound eagle and swastika statue that was raised in 2006. It's one of just a handful of known surviving examples of the Third Reich's symbol and was seen by many as a controversial reminder of the 9,000 Nazis who fled to South America to avoid prosecution for their war crimes. The statue and numerous other artifacts were salvaged under the command of a businessman named Alfredo Echegaray, who claimed that he spent over $5 million retrieving artifacts from the Graf Spe over a 30-year period. A court ruled that Echegaray legally owns half the statue and that the government also owns half. The businessman accused Germany of pressuring the Uruguayan government to keep the controversial sculpture hidden from the public. He said that the German government has every right to bury an artifact from a dark chapter in history, but that it should at least pay him his fair share in order to do so. The art gallery housing the statue claimed that it was receiving offers for Echegaray's share of ownership, which is supposedly valued at up to $15 million. But the former head of the National Heritage Commission, William Ray Ashfield, scoffed at the estimate. He was one of several people who thought that the statue should go to a museum and be displayed in an educational but not glorifying historical context. Others wanted to see the Nazi relic destroyed. The battle appears to be ongoing. At last update, a court decided that the statue should be auctioned off, leaving many concerned that it would fall into the hands of neo-Nazis. Number 3. SS Sagang. Built in the mid-1920s, the 455-foot-long British passenger and cargo ship SS Sagang routinely traveled between Liverpool, England, and the Burmese city of Rangoon while occasionally sailing other routes, including North America and the Caribbean. In 1939, a German U-boat chased and shot torpedoes at the Sagang in the North Atlantic Ocean while sailing as part of a merchant convoy. Several passengers boarded a lifeboat and were lost at sea, although the ship escaped serious harm. The vessel was less lucky in early 1942 when it left Glasgow after undergoing repairs and headed for Rangoon with a top-secret cargo of munitions aboard. After leaving the port of Colombo in Sri Lanka for Trincomalee Harbor, the crew received a warning that a Japanese attack was likely. The Sagang spent several days at Trincomalee, waiting out several false alarms of impending Japanese attacks before being struck without warning in an air raid. Its captain was incapacitated and the ship began to take on water and list. As the attack continued, a fire broke out. Crew members scrambled to prepare the lifeboats for launching, and most of the passengers and cargo were ultimately saved. In 2013, what's left of the crumbling ship was deliberately scuttled in about 35 feet of water as a pier for naval ships. 4 years later, workers embarked on a 5-month effort to raise and move the vessel to make more room in the harbor. The wreck was sunk again outside the harbor. Number 2. USS Monitor. Built in 1862 for the United States Navy, the USS Monitor was an ironclad warship commissioned by then-President Abraham Lincoln in response to news that the Confederate military was building a similar type of ship. It was ready to set sail just a little over 3 months after being built in Brooklyn, New York. The 179-foot-long ship participated in the Battle of Hampton Roads in Virginia, where it exchanged gunfire with the Confederate ship CSS Virginia. Its career wouldn't last for long, though, and in December of 1862, the Monitor embarked on what would turn out to be its final voyage to Beaufort, North Carolina. The plan was for the ship to join 2 others as part of a blockade off Charleston. 4 days after celebrating Christmas on the vessel, the crew set out for Beaufort. They knew that the Monitor wasn't seaworthy, but they didn't question their orders. While being towed out to sea by a tugboat, the ship encountered a brutal storm and began taking on water and rolling uncontrollably. The crew was unable to pump water out fast enough to stop it from sinking. After numerous attempts to save the Monitor, the surviving crew members abandoned the ship and it sank 16 miles off Cape Hatteras. 16 crew members died at sea and 47 were rescued by the tugboat that had been pulling the vessel when it ran into trouble. The wreck was rediscovered in 1973, 111 years after its sinking, during a joint expedition undertaken by the National Geographic Society, Duke University, and the National Science Foundation. To stop divers and salvage companies from exploiting the wreck, the area surrounding the Monitor became the nation's first designated marine sanctuary in 1975. Efforts to raise the wreck began 20 years later in 1995. Over the course of several years, various parts of the ship were recovered, including its anchor and turret, as well as the remains of 2 sailors and a gold wedding band. The sailors were given a proper burial, and the salvaged parts of the Monitor were conserved and put on display along with a replica of the ship. Number 1. H.L. Hunley. The naval submarine H.L. Hunley, also known as the CSS Hunley, first carried Confederate soldiers into battle in 1863. While entering Charleston Harbor during a mission to destroy a Union blockade on the city, something caused the sub to sink, killing 5 of the men on board. The H.L. Hunley was relaunched a few months later after undergoing repairs, but its 8-member crew died because someone left a valve open, causing the vessel to take on water and sink. Once again, the Confederate Navy recovered the submarine and put it back into service, launching it for a 3rd time in 1864. It managed to sink the U.S. Navy ship USS Housatonic with a torpedo before vanishing, making it the first combat submarine to sink a warship. The submarine remained missing until 1995 when a team of shipwreck hunters discovered it in Charleston Harbor, right next to the Housatonic. It was raised 5 years later and remains on display at a museum. Nobody knows what caused the H.L. Hunley to sink. According to the nonprofit Friends of the Hunley, the crew may have run out of oxygen and suffocated to death due to the tides. Another ship may have clipped the sub. It may have been destroyed by its own torpedo, or an enemy shooter may have somehow disabled the captain, causing the submarine to fill with water and drown the crew. But these are all guesses, and we'll probably never know exactly what doomed the Hunley.
5. Forgotten wartime shipwrecks. Forgotten shipwrecks litter the floor of the Atlantic Ocean, dating back to the First World War. These liners were sunk by mines and torpedoes off the Irish coast and now lie in watery graves among the sand. The HMS Audacious, which sank in October of 1914, is the oldest ruin found here, but there are also submarines, ocean liners, and merchant vessels. The Audacious was swallowed by the ocean after it was hit by a German mine, but luckily all of the passengers except for one was rescued by the White Star liner Olympic, the sister ship to the Titanic. The haunting wreck of the German U-boat 89 can be seen here as well. After only 6 months in service with the Imperial German Navy, it was sunk on February 12, 1918, after taking damage when it was rammed by HMS Roxburgh. Sadly, everyone on board the U-89 lost their lives. The HMS Victor, which was an armed merchant cruiser, can also be found on the seabed in the same general area. Unlike the HMS Audacious, the Victor sank mysteriously without sending a single distress signal. On board the ship were 295 Royal Navy officers, who were all thought to have perished during its sinking. According to ship records from the 1900s, the Victor went on patrol from the River Tyne on December 28, 1914, and then on January 1st, she joined in on patrol off the north coast of Scotland. The captain and crew had been tasked with finding and stopping the Norwegian America Line ship known as the Bergensford, which was believed by the UK government to be harboring a German spy. The HMS Victor found Bergensford and detained the vessel. It then escorted the ship to Kirkwall in Orkney, where the suspected spy and several other prisoners were then transferred to the Victor. After they completed their mission, they set sail for Liverpool, but never made it to their destination. Nobody knows for sure exactly what happened to this ship. However, there is a theory which states the Victor could have been sunk by a German naval mine, which is why it never sent out a distress signal. And shortly after the ship sank, parts of the wreck and many bodies began washing up on shore. Surprisingly, the wrecked remains of the HMS Victor were not discovered until 91 years later in 2006, as it's believed that it sank into the ocean on January 13, 1915. The long-forgotten wartime vessel now sits at the bottom of the sea, under approximately 250 feet of water. Most of the wrecks that are found in the Atlantic Ocean are at depths which are beyond the reach of recreational divers. In order to explore the abandoned ships, specialized equipment and exotic gases that are associated with technical diving are required. Historic England has estimated that there could be around 40,000 shipwrecks scattered around the coast of the British Isles that are still waiting to be discovered. 4. The Bloop. The Bloop was a high-amplitude, ultra-low-frequency underwater sound that was detected by the US National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in the year 1997. When it was first recorded, scientists were at a loss as to what the noise was, but over the years, many theories have been suggested. The source of the bloop originated from a remote point in the South Pacific Ocean. It was triangulated to be roughly 50 degrees south and 100 degrees west near the southern tip of South America. The sound was captured by a system of hydrophones that are primarily used to monitor undersea, ice noise, seismicity, and marine mammal migration and population, known as the Equatorial Pacific Ocean Autonomous Hydrophone Array. The system was designed and built by NOAA's Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory in order to augment the administration's use of the US Navy Sound Surveillance System. They explained that when they first detected the noise, it continued to rise in frequency over roughly 1 minute, and its amplitude was sufficient enough to be captured on multiple sensors at a range of over 3,000 miles. A sound of this magnitude had never before been recorded, which sparked the first rumor to explain the bloop's origin. People jumped at the opportunity to propose that some kind of giant sea creature had to have been responsible for the mysterious sound. With no other sounds quite like it, theories of massive whales, giant squids, and other sea life unknown to science began to circulate in the media. Other theories, such as underwater military exercises, were also proposed, but nothing was confirmed until 2005. Researchers from PMEL continued to deploy hydrophones even closer to Antarctica over the next couple of years, in hopes of capturing exactly what they'd captured in 1997. They studied the sounds of earthquakes and seafloor volcanoes, and it was here that they discovered the true source of the bloop. They were able to confirm that after years of research, the thunderous rumbles from the deep had been nothing more than an ice quake. They found that this sound occurs when an iceberg cracks and breaks away from an Atlantic glacier. With global warming continuing to be a crisis, more and more ice quakes are occurring annually, and it's likely that the bloop sound will be captured many more times in the coming future, but now we'll be able to identify it as what it really is. 3. The Kraken. While we're on the subject of terrifying underwater mysteries, we have to talk about the famed sea monster known as the Kraken. The legendary creature of enormous proportions has been said to appear off the coasts of Norway. The first description of the Kraken came from a travelogue written by Francesco Negri at the beginning of the 18th century in 1700. Negri was an Italian Catholic priest that traveled in Scandinavia and later published an account of everything he saw during his journey. Then, in 1734, Hans Gerde, a Dano-Norwegian explorer and missionary, described the Kraken in full detail, comparing it to the Hafgufa, which is a massive sea monster from medieval lore. And although rumors of the legendary beast had already begun to circulate, the first description of the Kraken is typically credited to Pontoppidan, a Norwegian bishop in 1753. He was the first to liken the Kraken to an octopus of tremendous size, and explained in his writings that the sea creature had a reputation for pulling ships underwater. Pontoppidan claimed that the marine monster was often mistaken as a group of tiny islands with ample fish swimming in between them. But when fishermen would throw their lines over the sides of their boat, the Kraken would trap and sink them with its many arms. He also explained that seamen were in danger due to the giant whirlpool that would appear every time the beast submerged itself under the water. Over the years, there have been numerous paintings and artworks dedicated to the mysterious Kraken, which depict the struggle between man and the sea monster. One such famous piece of art, called The Kraken of the Imagination by John Gibson, was created in 1887. But the oldest drawing of the giant octopus was drawn in 1801 by Pierre Denis Montfort, which proves that the belief of the legendary Kraken has been alive and well for over 200 years. Even though there is no definitive proof that this monster really exists, it's not impossible to think that a creature similar to a massive octopus could be living in the depths of the ocean. Many people still believe in the Kraken to this day, and the legend of this beast will likely live on for the unforeseeable future. Do you believe that the Kraken really could exist? Let us know what you think in the comments, and while you're at it, hit that subscribe button. 2. Mexico's cursed shipwreck. The Gulf of Mexico has come to be known as one of the richest locations for maritime archaeology in the world. Around 4,000 shipwrecks can be found scattered about the seafloor, including those that are in nearshore shallows, as well as ships that have been sunk under thousands of feet of darkness. However, one of these shipwrecks is not like the others and has mysteriously been labeled as cursed by several people who have attempted to study the underwater wreck. Various research teams have tried to study this wrecked ship over the years, but the first of many disastrous attempts was made in January of 2002. Teams from the Mineral Management Service and the Nautical Archaeology program at Texas A&M University worked together to try and produce more detailed recording and mapping of the site, and also plan to collect data, samples, and artifacts from the wreck. Brett A. Fano from TAMU was hoping to bring something up from the ship that would help them identify a definitive date on the sunken vessel. However, the teams ran into nothing but problems. They first sent down a mini submarine to view the wreck, but after just 30 minutes in the water, the hydraulic system balked and stopped working. Then, when they tried video monitoring of the site, the cameras blacked out every time the thrusters were engaged. A few mishaps might have been explained by the unreliability of technology, but their issues didn't end there. When the mini-sub finally did reach the wreck, the sonar failed, and the scientists' many attempts to reboot the system had no effect. 6 months later, in July of that same year, a team working on board the NR-1 and the Carolyn Chuest tried their hand at launching a robotic submarine to the wrecked ship site. Not surprisingly, things didn't go how they hoped. The moment the rover hit the water, it veered off course and went completely out of control. The tether that was attached to the submarine became entangled in the ship's propellers, which caused the rover to crash into the underside of the Carolyn Chuest. The team was actually unable to recover the submarine, and they never saw it again. The crew from the NR-1 had been on the seabed when the first accident occurred, but they weren't aware of the failure. They set about their own work and mapped the entire site and even shot video of the area and the wreckage. However, when they deployed their vessel equipped with robot arms to recover artifacts from the site, they found the arms were too short to grab onto any of the desired pieces. So they instead tried for the stern post that was positioned where the rudder once stood, which they believed had identifying marks etched onto it. However, disaster struck once again, and upon reaching the surface, the vessel's hydraulic system failed, the robotic arms went limp, and the post vanished beneath the water, never to be found again. These were not the only cursed expeditions to try and gain more information on this sunken ship. And, as of today, the origins behind this vessel that is shrouded in darkness and 2,600 feet below the surface remains a mystery. Baltic Sea Anomaly. An interesting sonar image captured by Dennis Aberg, Peter Lindberg, and their Swedish OceanX diving team has now been named the Baltic Sea Anomaly. They had been treasure hunting on the bottom of the northern Baltic Sea in the middle of the Gulf of Bothnia in June of 2011 when they came across the mysterious sonar image. The diving team suggested that the photo showed a distinct object with unusual features resting deep underneath the freezing waters between Sweden and Finland. They have been unable to identify exactly what the object is, but it seems to be of non-natural origins and rises a reported 10 to 13 feet from the seabed. Their discovery prompted speculation that was published in tabloid newspapers, informing their readers that it was a sunken UFO. OceanX claimed that their sonar image shows a 197-foot diameter round object that has features resembling stairways, ramps, and other structures that are not regularly produced by nature. The group allegedly attempted to revisit the site in 2012 to get a more clear image, but they apparently ran into some mysterious electrical interference that prevented them from doing so. After this incident, even more stories were published, specifically by the UK newspaper The Daily Mail in June of that year, and rumors continued to circulate that the object was either a UFO, a portal into another world, or an underwater Stonehenge. Samples of stone that were supposedly taken from the site by OceanX were handed over to Volker Bruchert, a professor of geology at Stockholm University. Bruchert analyzed the samples and found that the rocks were mostly made of gneisses, granites, and sandstones. There was also a single piece of basaltic or volcanic rock included among the specimens, which was definitely out of place on the seafloor but not ridiculously unusual. The entire northern Baltic region is heavily influenced by glacial thawing processes, and because of this, Bruchert believes that the rock samples likely formed in connection with both glacial and post-glacial developments. He even believes that the rock shown on the sonar image could have been transported there by glaciers, which would explain the volcanic rock that was found at the site. However, this theory has not been confirmed. The Baltic Sea Anomaly still remains a mystery to this day, not because of lack of knowledge, but due to its sheer size and specific shape. Scientists and explorers are still unable to determine the exact reason why such a unique formation was shaped at the bottom of the sea. The object is submerged at a depth of roughly 300 feet beneath the Gulf's waters, and has led some to speculate that it could be an asteroid or meteorite that fell to the seafloor. But the most believed theory regarding the Baltic Sea Anomaly is that it's an alien spaceship or spacecraft. Even though there's not much evidence to support this claim, there isn't really evidence to dispute it either. However, this belief is supported by the findings of the OceanX diving team, who's been able to capture footage of an alleged 985-foot runway, which leads to the object like a staircase. Which of these underwater mysteries did you find the most terrifying? 8. Mausoleum Emila Beckera. Tucked inside a forest outside the city of Jelenia Góra in southwestern Poland, there's a mausoleum that once contained abandoned movie memorabilia from the 2017 horror film Redwood. The most noteworthy piece was a large demon statue that looks like something straight out of a nightmare. A Facebook post from 2020 claims that an unknown artist created, or at least left, the statue overnight. A comment on the post claims that the statue was destroyed in 2019. The social media who shared the information, along with an image of the destroyed piece, stated that the perpetrators were still at large. Information about the obscure site is hard to find. According to PolandTravelTours.com, the mausoleum was built for a German millionaire named Emil Becker, who came to own the surrounding town of Masiedziała during the 19th century. His brother-in-law reportedly built the mausoleum as a place to lay Becker's remains to rest after he passed away in 1891. 7. Alvera Bunkers. In 1825, a rural village called Wisetown was established in what is now Union County, Pennsylvania. It was later renamed Alvera. At its peak, it was home to 165 landowners and grew to include a church, a barbershop, and a store. When the US entered World War II in 1941 following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the federal government prioritized the production of war materials. In the spring of 1942, the Fed seized possession of Alvera for the construction of an ordnance depot. They took 8,000 acres of land through eminent domain and gave residents cash settlements along with instructions to move. Betty E. Yoder, whose parents were among those evicted from Alvera, told the Daily Item in 2017 that her parents received $2,400 for their 58-acre plot of land and used it to buy another farm elsewhere. Although residents were bought out, the government allegedly told them that they'd be able to return to the town someday and that they'd find all of their buildings as they'd left them. But this was a lie, and every structure in the town was razed to the ground. In Alvera's place, they built the Susquehanna Ordnance Depot, which consisted of 149 concrete igloo-style bunkers that were used for storing TNT. After realizing they'd overestimated their need for the explosive, the government emptied out the bunkers and divvied up parts of the land to various new owners, including the military and correctional facilities. The property containing the bunkers was turned over to the state of Pennsylvania and designated as game land. The bunkers still stand today. Most are camouflaged by brush and foliage, and some are still accessible, but many are welded and locked shut. Those that are open tend to be heavily vandalized. And although all the houses in Alvera were torn down, its cemetery is still there, along with a few stone foundations that were never ripped out after the structures they supported were torn down. 6. Stalin's Gulag Road. In the early decades of the Soviet era, millions of people were imprisoned in a network of forced labor camps known as the Gulag. It functioned as a tool for punishing political dissenters and criminals, ranging from petty thieves to career crooks. The incarcerated population peaked under Joseph Stalin's rule between the 1930s and the 50s. Starting in 1947, tens of thousands of prisoners were sent to the remote reaches of northern Siberia to lay a railroad that was meant to connect Western Russia's railway network with the Arctic Ocean. While any records of why exactly Stalin wanted the connection built are long gone, it's believed that he planned to use it to supply a planned Arctic naval port and to link remote nickel mines with Western factories. But this vision was never realized. The project was abruptly cancelled just days after Stalin's death in 1953 and has remained abandoned ever since. What's left of the railroad is dotted with the remains of Gulag camps that once housed forced laborers. Reaching the heavily forested ruins, known today as the Dead Road, involves traveling over harsh terrain and requires the use of specialized heavy-duty vehicles in most cases, and the sites can only be accessed outside the winter season. Every year, the heavy snowfall causes the mostly wooden structures to fall further into decay. When the overgrown barracks were still in use, captives endured excruciatingly cold winter temperatures that often dropped below -40 degrees Fahrenheit. The harsh and unforgiving conditions meant that very few inmates even dared to try escaping, and those who attempted to flee were either caught quickly or didn't survive for very long. Anyone who tried to flee was likely facing death either way, whether from exposure to the elements or from the brutal punishment they faced upon being recaptured. In addition to prisoner housing, the rundown sites consist of cabins that once housed guards. These structures tend to be in much better shape than other structures, thanks to the hunters who repurposed and maintained them over the years. The Dead Road is also lined with the crumbling remains of railroad bridges, punishment cells, and other reminders of the grueling work that went into building something that was never even used. 5. Agdam. The town of Agdam was founded during the 18th century in what is now southwestern Azerbaijan. It saw some of its greatest growth during the Soviet era, when its population reached over 28,000 residents. Agdam's economy was based largely on butter, wine, and brandy production, as well as its silk and machine factories. In 1988, ethnic Armenians and Azerbaijani forces began to fight over control of the region in what became known as the First Nagorno-Karabakh War. The Azerbaijani military used Agdam as a base for launching attacks, while the Armenians relentlessly targeted the city, and residents were exposed to horrific violence. Armenian forces seized Agdam in 1993, and residents fled. It stands today as a ghost town, filled with buildings that were destroyed to deter people from returning. The only structure that remains intact is the Agdam Mosque, which was repurposed as a cattle shed and is covered in graffiti. Agdam was returned to Azerbaijan in 2020 as part of an agreement brokered after yet another war broke out in the region. Cleanup efforts are ongoing in hopes of turning the destroyed settlement back into a functional city. Do you think the town of Agdam will ever be restored to its former glory? Let us know in the comments below and hit that subscribe button while you're at it. 4. West Virginia Penitentiary. Built during the 1870s in Moundsville, West Virginia, the West Virginia Penitentiary is a huge Gothic-style structure that looks like an old castle or mansion at first glance. The prison was home to an infamous electric chair nicknamed Old Sparky. Built by an inmate named Paul Glenn, it was used for many of the more than 100 executions that were carried out at the property, either by electrocution or hanging. Most of the prisoners were locked up for serious crimes. Life was particularly harsh among the high population of death row inmates, but the conditions were brutal for everyone at the West Virginia Penitentiary, starting in the early 20th century. One recreation room, nicknamed the Sugar Shack, was notorious for gambling, fighting, and assault. Disease was rampant throughout the facility, thanks to bad plumbing and insect infestations. As many as 3 inmates were confined to each cell, which measured 5 by 7 feet. 2 prisoners slept in the bunks, while the third was relegated to a mattress on the floor. To reduce overcrowding, officials decided in 1929 to double the size of the facility. Inmates carried out the expansion, which was finally finished 30 years later in 1959. A number of major violent incidents happened at the West Virginia Penitentiary. In 1973, prisoners revolted and set the basement on fire in protest of the horrifying conditions they were forced to endure. 13 years later, in 1986, 20 inmates stormed the cafeteria. There were several high-profile breakouts over the years as well, including an incident in 1979 when 15 prisoners escaped. Finally, in 1995, a court ruled that the conditions and the facility were inhumane and ordered its closure. Today, it's considered one of the most haunted abandoned prisons in the US. It operates as a museum, where visitors can see old Sparky on display and witness the cramped, squalid conditions that thousands of inmates were subjected to. 3. Bou Hill Station. When the French military pushed its way into the Cambodian jungle, they weren't prepared for the sweltering heat and humidity, which proved in many cases to be life-threatening to some soldiers. To give them a break from the oppressive tropical conditions, the military built a resort town called Bou Hill Station during the 1920s. Located in the remote mountains of Kampot province, it was like a small, elegant city with all the amenities of a basic outpost, along with some surprising luxuries, including a post office, a church, a hotel, and a casino. Providing this upscale reprieve came at an immense cost in human lives. Around 900 workers died while building Bou Hill, which sits at 3,438 feet above sea level and is surrounded by dense foliage and unforgiving terrain. The French abandoned the property when the First Indochina War broke out in the 1940s. It was briefly reopened as a resort during the 1960s, but it was deserted again in 1972 when the Khmer Rouge took control of the region. From then until the 1990s, it functioned as a stronghold of the regime. Today, the former hotel, church, and several other structures sit as a crumbling reminder of decades of warfare, but that won't be the case for long. Until recently, the only path leading directly to it was an old, destroyed road that's no longer used on a regular basis, but tourists can now easily reach the site via a modern highway. The Sokimex investment group has leased the property and is carrying out renovations with plans to turn it into a bigger and improved resort with a golf course, several restaurants, a hospital, more hotels, and more. 2. Granadilla. Founded by Muslims during the 9th century during what is now central western Spain, the town of Granadilla was located along a vital route connecting Europe and Africa. Originally called Granada, it functioned as a fortress town throughout the Middle Ages. It was surrounded by high walls that protected homes and other buildings, including a tall guard tower known as the Castle of Granadilla. The town changed hands several times over the centuries, but it was continuously inhabited until the 1950s when a reservoir was built in the region. At the time, the country was under the rule of dictator Francisco Franco, who began ordering the construction of dams as a way to boost Spain's economy during a period of isolation. Officials determined that Granadilla was within the floodplain of Franco's biggest dam project, known as the Gabriel y Galán Reservoir, and evicted all 1,000 residents over a 10-year period. During that time, the bridge leading to the town's entrance was submerged, effectively turning Granadilla into an island for several years. Locals now had to travel by boat to get anywhere outside the town, effectively isolating them from other settlements nearby and making it much more inconvenient just to run an everyday errand in a neighboring community. Evicted residents were relocated to planned villages, many without electricity and other basic modern conveniences. The new lives that people were thrown into were much harder than the ones they were forced to leave behind. The site never flooded, even when the reservoir's water levels were at their highest, but Granadilla's former residents were banned from returning. The town has remained abandoned since 1969. Its walls are still intact, and the homes, churches, and other structures within appear as if everyone simply picked up and left one day. Since 1984, Granadilla has undergone continuous preservation efforts, but otherwise remains exactly as it was left more than 40 years ago, as if its former occupants will return any day. But that's unlikely to ever happen, because Spain maintains the decree signed by Franco that designates the village as a flood zone, even though it's never flooded and sits above the reservoir. Today, it operates as a tourism and educational site. The land is municipally owned, and surviving former residents of Granadilla are still frustrated over the trauma of having been forcibly relocated during their childhoods. 1. Carry furnaces. Located outside Pittsburgh along the Monongahela River, the Cary furnaces are disused blast furnaces that operated from 1907 to 1978 as part of the Homestead Steelworks plant. Standing at 92 feet tall, they're among the only surviving 20th century blast furnaces from before World War II. At its peak, the company produced 1,000 to 1,250 tons of iron per day. Its glory days came to an end when the steel industry collapsed during the 1970s and 80s. Enclosed by train tracks and surrounded by wild plants, the lone post-industrial structures that remain today stand in stark contrast to the once bustling factory. They became a National Historic Landmark in 2006. Anyone looking to take a step back in time can visit the Cary furnaces and learn about the prosperous days when Pittsburgh dominated the steel industry through guided tours that discuss the site's iron-making technology, workers, and culture. Thanks for watching. Which one of these places was the creepiest to you? Tell us in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.